Good morning. Happy New Year. We are back into the Ranger's Apprentice. We last left them. Horace and Will and Evelyn were going and found out what the Wargles and Morgrath were up to, building a bridge. And they're in the tunnel, and Horace is staying by the opening, and Will is going into the tunnel to see what's going on. The tunnel, level at first, began to angle steeply upward as Will went on, leaving Horace behind him. The walls and floor showed evidence of the Celts' picks and drills as they had torn and gouged at the rock to widen the path. Will guessed that the original narrow tunnel had been nothing more than a natural fault in the rock, a mere crevice. But as he went on, he saw how much it had been widened until there was room for 4 or 5 men to walk abreast. And still it climbed up into the heart of the mountain. A circle of light showed the end of the tunnel. He estimated that he had traveled maybe 300 meters in total, and the end was another 40 away. The light that he had could see seemed to be stronger than simple moonlight, and as he carefully emerged from the tunnel, he saw why. Here, the hills separated, forming a large valley about 200 meters across and half a kilometer long. To one side, the moonlight showed him massive wooden structures leading up to the higher reaches of the plateau. Staircases, he realized after a few moments' study. The floor of the valley was lit with campfires, and there were hundreds of figures moving in the flickering orange light. Will guessed that this would be the assembly area for Morgrath's army. At the moment, it was where the Wargles kept their cult prisoners at night. He paused, trying to form a picture of the overall situation. The plateau that formed the greater part of Morgrath's domain was still at least 50 meters above this point. But the staircases and the less formidable slope of the surrounding hills would provide relatively easy access down to the valley. The valley itself must be some 30 meters above the level where the bridge stood. The sloping tunnel would take troops down to the bridge from here. Once again, Halt's words echoed in his ear. Nowhere is really impassable. He moved to the left of the tunnel mouth and found cover in a jumble of rocks and boulders while he took stock of the situation. There was a rough stockade in the center of the valley. Inside the wooden fencing, he could see a large number of small fires, each with a group of figures seated or sprawled around it. This was the prisoners' campground, he guessed. Large fires outside the compound marked the places where the Wargles were camped. He could see the hulking, shambling forms clearly against the firelight as they moved around. Yet, there was one fire close to him that seemed different. The figures seemed more upright, more humanoid in the way they stood and carried themselves. Curiously, he worked his way closer to it, sliding through the night with barely a sound, moving quickly from one patch of cover to the next, until he was just at the outer ring of light thrown by the fire, a spot where he knew the darkness, by contrast, would seem more intense to those sitting around the fire. There was a haunch of some kind of meat roasting slowly over the fire, and the smell of it set his mouth watering. He had been traveling for days on cold rations, and the meat filled the air with a delicious fragrance. He felt his stomach begin to rumble, and fear stabbed through him. It would be unthinkably bad luck to be betrayed by a rumbling stomach, he thought. The fear did the trick, killing his appetite. His digestion more or less under control, he edged his face around a boulder, low to the ground, to get a better look at the figures eating by the fire. As he did so, one of them leaned forward to slice off a hunk of the meat, juggling the hot, greasy food in his hand as he took it. The movement let the firelight shine clearly on him, and Will could see that these were not Wargles. From their rough sheepskin vests, woolen leggings bound with tapes, and heavy seal fur boots, he recognized them as Scandians. Further study showed him their horned helmets, round wooden shields, and battle axes piled to one side of the campsite. He wondered what they were doing here, so far from the ocean. The man who had moved finished his meat and wiped his hands on his sheepskin vest. He belched, then settled himself in a more comfortable spot by the fire. I'll be glad when Ovek's men get here, he said in the thick, almost indecipherable accent of Scandia. Will knew that Scandians spoke the same tongue as the kingdom. Hearing it now for the first time, though, he barely recognized it. The other sea wolves growled their agreement. There were 4 of them around the fire. Will edged forward a little to hear them more clearly, and then froze, horrified, as he saw the unmistakable shambling form of a Wargle moving directly toward him from the other side of the fire. The Scandians heard him coming and looked up warily. With an immense feeling of relief, Will realized that the creature was not coming toward him, but was approaching the Scandians' fire. "Hello," said one of the Scandians in a low voice. "Here comes one of Morgrath's beauties." The Wargle had stopped on the far side of the fire. He grunted something unintelligible at the group of sea raiders. The one who had just spoken shrugged. "Sorry, handsome, didn't catch that," he said. There was an obvious note of hostility in his voice. The Wargle seemed to sense it. He repeated his statement, growing angry now. Again, the circle of Scandian warriors shrugged at him. The Wargle grunted again, growing angrier by the minute. He gestured at the meat hanging over the fire and then at himself. He shouted at the Scandians now, making eating gestures. "Ugly brute wants our venison," said one of the Scandians. There was a low growl of dissent from the group. "Let him catch his own," said the first man. The Wargle stepped inside the circle now. He had stopped shouting. He simply pointed to the meat, then turned his red, glaring eyes on the speaker. Somehow, the silence was more menacing than his shouting had been. "Careful, Iraq," warned one of the Scandians. "We're outnumbered here at the moment." Iraq scowled at the Wargle for a second, then seemed to realize the wisdom of his friend's advice. He gestured angrily at the meat. "Go on, take it," he said curtly. The Wargle stepped forward and snatched the wooden spit from the fire, taking a huge bite at the meat and tearing a large chunk loose. Even from where he was lying, scarcely daring to breathe, Will could see the ugly light of triumph in the red animal eyes. Then the Wargle turned abruptly and bounded out of the circle, forcing several of the Scandians to move hurriedly aside to avoid being trampled on. They heard his guttural laugh as he faded into the darkness. "Those things give me the heebies," muttered Eric. "Don't know why we have to have anything to do with them." "'Cause Horth don't trust Morgorath," one of the others told him. "If we're not along, these bear men will keep all the plunder for themselves, and we'll get is hard fighting at the plains of Uthal." "And hard marching, too," put in another. "Wouldn't be any fun with Horth's men here, either, working their way around Thorntree Forest to take the enemy in the rear. That's tough going, all right." Will frowned as he heard that. Obviously, Morgorath and Horth, who Will assumed was a Scandian war leader, were planning another treacherous surprise for the kingdom's forces. He tried to picture a map of the countryside around the plains of Uthal, but his memory was sketchy. He wished he had paid more attention to the geography lessons Halt had taught him. "Why is geography so important?" he remembered asking his teacher. "Because maps are important if you want to know where your enemy is and where he's going," had been the reply. Glumly, Will realized now how right he had been. Halt had shaken his head at him then, in that mock-serious way he had. Suddenly thinking of his wise and capable teacher, Will felt very lonely and more than a little out of his depth. "Anyway," Eric was saying, "things will be different when Ovak's men get here, although they seem to be taking their time about it." "Relax," said the other speaker. "It'll take a few days to get 500 men from South Cliffs. Think how long it took us." "Yeah," said another, "but we were blazing a trail. All they have to do is follow it." "Well, they can't get here too soon for me," said Eric, rising and stretching. "I'm for sleep, lads, just as soon as I've done the necessaries." "Well, don't do 'em here by the fire," said one of the others irritably. "Go up behind them rocks there." Horrified, Will realized that the Scandians had gestured toward the rocks where he was hiding. And now Eric, laughing at the other men, was turning and heading his way. It was definitely time to go. He scuttled backwards a few meters, then, crawling rapidly on his stomach, used all his training and natural skill to blend with the available cover. He had gone perhaps 20 meters when he heard a splashing sound from the spot where he had been eavesdropping. Then he heard a contented sigh and, looking back, saw the shaggy-haired form of Eric, silhouetted against the glow of the 100 or so campfires in the valley. Realized that the Scandian was intent on what he was doing, Will slipped through the darkness and back into the tunnel. He went carefully for the first few meters, allowing his eyes to become accustomed to the dim light of the torches. Then he began to run, his soft-hide boots making barely a noise on the sandy floor. See where I get here. All right. Let's go over there. All right, chapter 21. He had found Horus waiting for him, his hand ready on his sword hilt where he had left him in the tunnel. "Did you find out anything?" the apprentice warrior whispered hoarsely. Will let go of pent-up breath, realizing that he had been holding it for some time now. "Plenty," he said. "All of it bad." He held up a hand to forestall Horus's further questions. "Let's get back across the bridge," he said. "I'll tell you then." He glanced into the side tunnel where they had left the Celt miner. "Have you heard anything more from Glendus?" he asked. Horus shrugged sadly. "He started moaning about an hour ago, and then he went quiet. I think he's dead. At least he died the way he wanted to," he said. And then he followed Will back through the dimly lit tunnel to the bridge. They made their way across the planking again to where Evelyn waited with the horses, well back from the bridge and out of sight. When they were close, Will called her name softly so as to avoid startling her. Horace had left his dagger with Evelyn, and Will thought an armed Evelyn would not be a person to approach unexpectedly. As he described the scene at the other end of the tunnel, he hastily scratched a map in the sand for them. "Somehow we're going to have to find a way to delay Morgarath's forces," he said. The other two looked at him curiously. Delay them? How could 2 apprentices and a girl delay 500 Scandians and several thousand relentless Wargles? "I thought you said we should get word to the king," Evelyn said. "We don't have time anymore," Will said simply. "Look." They leaned forward as he smoothed over the diagram he had drawn in the sand and hastily sketched out a new one. He wasn't sure that it was totally accurate, but at least it included the most important features of the kingdom, as well as a southern plateau where Morgarath ruled. "They said they have more Scandians coming up the cliffs on the southeast coast to join the Wargles we've already seen. They'll cross the fissure here, where we are, and move north to attack the Baron in the rear, while they wait for Morgarath to try to break out of Three-Step Pass." "Yes," said Horace, "we know that. We guessed it as soon as we saw the bridge." Will looked up at him, and Horace fell silent. He realized that the ranger apprentice had something else to say. "But," said Will, emphasizing the word and pausing for a moment, "I also heard them saying something about Horth and his men marching around Thorntree Forest. That's up here to the north of the plains of Youthal." Evelyn grasped the point immediately. "Which would bring the Scandians northwest of the king's army. They'd be trapped between the Wargles and the Scandians who have crossed the bridge and the other force from the north." "Exactly," said Will, meeting her gaze. They could both appreciate how dangerous that situation would be for the assembled barons. Expecting a Scandian attack through the fenlands to the east, they'd be taken by surprise from not one, but 2 different directions, caught between the arms of a pincer and crushed. "Then we better warn the king, surely," insisted Horace. "Horace," said Will patiently, "it would take us 4 days to reach the plains." "Even more reason to get going. We haven't a moment to waste," said the young warrior. "And then," put in Evelyn, seeing Will's point, "it would take at least another 4 days for any sort of force to get back here and hold the bridge, maybe more." "That's 8 days all told," said Will. "Remember what that poor miner said. The bridge will be ready in 4 days' time. The Wargles and Scandians will have had plenty of time to cross the fissure, assemble in battle formation, and attack the king's army." "But," Horace began, and Will interrupted him. "Horace, even if we get warning to the king and the barons, they'll be badly outnumbered and they'll be caught between 2 forces with no way to retreat. The swamps of the fenlands will be behind them. Now, I know we have to get a warning to them, but we can also do something here to even the numbers." "Plus," Evelyn put in, and Horace turned to face her, "if we can do something to stop the Wargles and Scandians from crossing here, the king will have the advantage over this northern force of Scandians." Horace nodded. "They won't be outnumbered, I guess," he said. Evelyn nodded, but then added, "That's part of it, but those Scandians will be expecting reinforcements to attack the king from the rear, reinforcements that will never arrive." Understanding dawned in Horace's eyes. He nodded slowly several times. Then the frown returned. "But what can we do to stop the Wargles here?" he asked. Will and Evelyn exchanged a glance. He could see they'd come to the same conclusion. They both spoke at the same time. "Burn the bridge," they said. That's the title of the book. Burning Bridge. Okay, let me see here. I guess I'll keep going. Wait a minute. 1, 2. All right. Sorry. All right. Blaze's head hung low as he trotted slowly into the outskirts of the king's camp on the plains of Youthal. Galan swayed wearily in the saddle. They had barely slept in the past 3 days, snatching only brief rests once every 4 hours. So now we're back. We're away from Will and Horace and with Galan. 2 guards stepped forward to query his progress, and the young ranger fumbled inside his shirt for the silver amulet in the form of an oak leaf, the ranger's badge of office. At the sight of it, the guard stepped back hurriedly to clear the way. In times like these, nobody delayed a ranger, not if he knew what was good for him. Galan rubbed his gritty eyes. "Where's the war council tent?" One of the guards pointed with his spear to a larger-than-normal tent set up on a knoll overlooking the rest of the camp. There were more guards there and a large number of people coming and going. as one would expect at the nerve center of an army. "There, sir, on that small rise." Galan nodded. He had come so far, so fast, finishing the 4-day journey in just over 3. Now these few hundred meters seemed like miles to him. He leaned forward and whispered in Blaze's ear, "Not much farther, my friend. One more effort, please." The exhausted horse's ears twitched and his head came up a few inches. At Galan's gentle urging, he managed to raise a slow trot, and they passed through the camp. Dust drifting on the breeze, the smell of wood smoke, noise, and confusion, the camp was like any army camp anywhere in the world. Orders being shouted, the clang and rattle of arms being repaired or sharpened. Laughter from tents where men lay back relaxing with no duties to be performed, until their sergeants found them and discovered jobs for them to be doing. Galan smiled tiredly at the thought. Sergeants seemed to be totally averse to seeing their men having an easy time of it. Blaze came to a halt once more, and he realized with a jerk that he had actually nodded off in the saddle. Before him, 2 more guards barred the way to the War Council compound. He looked at them blearily. "King's Ranger," he croaked through a dry throat. "Message for the council." The guards hesitated. This dust-covered, half-asleep man seated on a lathered, exhausted bay horse might well be a ranger. He was certainly dressed like a ranger as far as they could tell. Yet the guards knew most of the senior rangers by sight, and they had never seen this young man before. And he showed no sign of identification. What's more, they noticed he carried a sword, which was definitely not a ranger's weapon, so they were reluctant to admit him to the carefully guarded War Council compound. Irritably, Galan realized that he had neglected to leave the silver oak leaf device hanging outside his shirt. The effort of finding it again suddenly became intense. He fumbled blindly at his collar. Then a familiar and very welcome voice cut through his consciousness. "Galan, what's happened? Are you all right?" That was the voice that had meant comfort and security to him throughout his years as an apprentice. The voice of courage and compatibility and wisdom. The voice that he knew exactly what action should be taken at any point in time. "Halt," he murmured, and he realized he was swaying, then falling from the saddle. Halt caught him before he hit the ground. He glared at the 2 sentries who were standing by, not sure whether to help or not. "Give me a hand," he ordered, and they leapt forward, dropping their spears with a clatter to support the semi-conscious young ranger. "Let's get you somewhere to rest," Halt said. "You're all in." Excuse me. But Galan summoned some last reserves of energy, and pushing clear of the soldiers, steadied himself on his own feet. "Important news," he said to Halt. "Must see the council. There's something bad going on in Celtica." Halt felt the cold hand of premonition clutch his heart. He cast his eyes around, looking back down the path where Galan had come. Bad news from Celtica, and Galan apparently alone. "Where's Will?" he asked quickly. "Is he all right?" "He's all right," Galan said, and the senior ranger's heart lifted just a little. "I came on ahead." As they had been talking, they had begun to move toward the central pavilion. There were more guards on duty here, but they moved out of the way at the sight of Halt. He was a familiar figure around the War Council. He put out a hand now to steady his former apprentice, and they entered the cool shade of the council pavilion. A group of 6 men were clustered around a sand map, a large table with the main features of the plains and mountains modeled in sand. They turned now at the sound of the new arrivals, and one of them hurried forward, concern written on his face. "Galan!" he cried. He was a tall man, and his graying hair showed him to be in his late 50s. But he still moved with the speed and grace of an athlete or a warrior. Galan gave that tired smile again. "Good morning, father," he said. For the tall gray-haired man was none other than Sir David, Battlemaster of Caraway Fife, and the supreme commander of the King's army. The Battlemaster looked quickly to Halt and caught the quick nod of reassurance there. Galan was all right, he realized, just exhausted. Then his sense of duty caught up with his fatherly reaction. "Greet your king properly." "Greet your king properly," he said softly, and Galan looked up to the group of men, all their attention now focused on him. He recognized Crowley, the Ranger Corps Commandant, and Baron Errold, and 2 other senior barons of the realm, Tyler of Drayden and Fergus of Caraway. But the figure in the center took his attention, a tall blond man in his late 30s with a short beard and piercing green eyes. He was broad-shouldered and muscular, because Duncan was not a king who let other men do all his fighting for him. He had trained with sword and lance since he was a boy, and he was regarded as one of the most capable knights in his own kingdom. Galan attempted to sink to one knee. His joints screamed in protest and tried to lock up on him. The pressure of Halt's hand under his arm was all that stopped him from falling once again. "My lord," he began apologetically, but Duncan had already stepped forward, seizing his hand to steady him. Galan heard Halt's introduction. Ranger Galan, my lord, attached to Merrick Fife with messages from Celtica. Suddenly, the king was galvanized with interest. Celtica? He repeated, studying Galan more closely. What's happening there? The other council members had moved from the sand map to the group around Galan. Baron Errold spoke. Galan was carrying your messages to King Sweden, my lord, he said, invoking our mutual defense treaty and requesting that Sweden send troops to join us. They won't be coming, Galan interrupted. He realized he had to tell the king his news before he collapsed from exhaustion. Morgorath has been then bottled up on the southwest peninsula. There was a stunned silence in the council tent. Finally, it was Galan's father who broke it. Morgorath, he said incredulously. How? How could he get any sort of army into Celtica? Galan shook his head, suppressing a huge need to yawn. They sent small numbers down the cliffs until they had enough troops to catch the Celts by surprise. As you know, Sweden keeps only a small standing army. Baron Errold nodded, anger showing on his face. I warned Sweden, my lord, he put in, but those Celts have always been more interested in digging than protecting their own land. Duncan made a small pacifying gesture with one hand. No time now for recriminations, Errold, he said softly. What's done is done, I'm afraid. I should imagine Morgorath has been watching them for years, waiting for their greed to overcome their good sense, Baron Tyler had said bitterly. The other men nodded quietly. Morgorath's ability to maintain a network of spies was all too well known. So, Celtica has been defeated by Morgorath? Is that what you're telling us? Duncan asked. This time as Galan shook his head, there was relieved glances around the tent. The Celts are holding out in the southwest, my lord. They're not defeated yet. But the strange business of it all is that the Wargle raiding parties have been carrying off the Celt miners. What? This time it was Crowley who interrupted. What earthly use has Morgorath for miners? Galan shrugged in reply. I have no idea, sir, he told his chief, but I thought I'd better get here with the news of it as soon as possible. You saw this happening then, Galan? Halt asked, frowning darkly as he puzzled over what the young ranger had just told them. Not exactly, Galan admitted. We saw the empty mining towns and the deserted border posts. We were heading deeper into Celtica when we met a young girl who told us about the raids. A young girl? The king asked. A Celt? No, my lord, she was an Arielan, a lady's maid whose mistress was visiting Sweden's court. Unfortunately, they ran into a war party. Evelyn was the only one to escape. Evelyn? Duncan said, his voice the merest whisper. The others turned to him as he spoke and were startled. The king's face had turned a chalky white, and his eyes were wide with horror. That was her name, my lord, said Galan, puzzled by the king's reaction. But Duncan wasn't listening. He had turned away and moved blindly to a canvas chair set by his small reading table. He dropped into the chair, his head sunk in his hands. The members of his war council moved toward him, alarmed at his reaction. My lord, said Sir David of Caraway, what is it? Duncan slowly raised his eyes to meet the battlemaster's. Evelyn, he said, his voice breaking with emotion. Evelyn was my daughter's maid. Oh. So King Duncan's daughter was the princess that Evelyn was helping. So I guess I'm going to stop there. So, well, welcome back to school 2021, and I'll see you in a little bit. Have a good day.